So here we are with my good friend, and I'm proud to call also my brother, Aaron Rock, brother in the faith. How you doing, Aaron?
Good Shade. Good to see you, buddy.
Hey, man.
Glad to be
Thanks.
on your show today.
Yeah, man. Thanks for coming on board. I want everyone to know who might be watching this video that my brother Aaron is a pastor at Harvest Bible. Would you like to extend on that for me, Aaron?
Sure, yeah, I could. So, yeah, Aaron Rock. I pastor Harvest Bible Church in Windsor. I've done so for 20 years, and I guess we're one of the churches that have sort of taken a bit of a stand against tyranny and statism and medical apartheid and segregation and discrimination and all that sort of stuff in our country. Taken a bit of a beating for that in the media and in terms of police presence and fines, but we're thankful that God is doing an amazing work and we're seeing a lot of lives transformed during these challenging times.
Yeah, and I've witnessed that for myself. I love coming to your congregation and listening to your teachings. And by the way, if anyone is interested in some great biblical teachings, I am going to leave a link below that you can click on and listen to Aaron. And I have to tell you, it's very, very edifying, and he does such a great job at taking what's going on in the scriptures and taking on what's going on today and making that application happen, and just really being able to see through the confusion and the noise when you hear Aaron speak. So I definitely recommend you do that. And today the main topic we're going to take on is Bill C-4. And if anyone watches my videos, you know that I've went out of my way to tell many people that when you have nefarious laws, often like, for example, in Daniel 6, in Esther 3, you see a nefarious law show up, or in the time of Jesus with the mandates of hand washing and things of this nature. When you have nefarious laws, it moves a nation in the wrong direction, and it actually begins to darken that nation. And nefarious laws is what bad people use to make that happen. And Bill C-4 appears to be one of those bills. And I heard Aaron speak on this, and that's part of the reason why I wanted you on, Aaron, because I thought you did such a great job at breaking down Bill C-4. So please let everyone know what Bill C-4 is really all about.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so Bill C-4 is a federal law in Canada. It has passed through the House of Commons and been ratified by the Senate. So it is now law. It's been law for a couple of weeks in Canada. It's colloquial called the conversion therapy bill, which is not what the bill is about. If you read the bill, that's not what it's about at all. It's a bill that was presented under the false premise that people are experiencing, for instance, electroshock therapy to convert them from homosexual behavior or transgender behavior to heterosexual. So the bill is basically presented as a bill that's trying to stop people from being tortured by the pro-heterosexual crowd. But if you read the bill, that's not what the bill is about at all. And I have read the bill. And by the way, if you violate the essence of the bill, they threaten you with jail time. So the state uses sort of the biggest tool, the biggest hammer in their toolbox, the criminal code, to try to penalize people who practice what they call conversion therapy. So again, it's not about torturing people. We would be opposed to that. We would be opposed to torturing people in order to forcibly convert them from, let's say, homosexuality to heterosexuality. But what the bill really is doing, it's a religious bill. It's an ideological bill. It explicitly states that anyone who tries to present to another person in a counseling session, through a practice, a service, therapy, that tries to present to another person that heterosexuality is the preferred norm for human behavior is propagating a myth. And the bill is very sly because it sort of violates biology by declaring that your sex is assigned to you at birth. Now, one of the things that those of us that are parents know, who have been in delivery rooms and seen our children birthed, is that you don't assign anything. You look at the child, you observe that child's biology. If it looks like a girl, it's a girl. You know what I mean? If it looks like a
Absolutely.
boy, it's a boy. So we don't assign sex to human beings. We observe it and we recognize it. This is a biological fact. If you have male organs, you're a male. If you have female organs, you're a female. This is true of humans. This is true in the animal world. It's a fact. But what Bill C-4 does is it sort of presents this radical leftist, radical sexual agendas view that your sex is assigned to you, that someone just arbitrarily says, that's a boy or that's a girl. And the law is attempting to ban that. So in order to ban conversations about human sexuality, what it does is it subjectifies human biology. It makes human biology a subjective thing. So if I choose to be a man, I can be a man. If I choose to be a woman, I can choose to be a woman. If I choose to be some newfangled gender, I can be a newfangled gender. So the bill really is what I would call a religious bill, an ideological bill, in that it's presenting a certain ideology, an ideological construct about human sexuality, and then seeking to put a muzzle, on anyone that speaks out against that. And the other thing that concerns those of us that are Christians is that it declares the content, for example, of the Bible as a myth. So it
And that's
actually
right in the
uses that
preamble,
word.
right? That's
It
right in the
uses that
preamble.
word, a
Yep.
myth, that any document that would propose, for example, that heterosexuality is the preferred norm for human behavior is guilty of propagating a myth. Well, clearly the Bible presents heterosexuality as the norm. In the creation account in Genesis 1, it said God made them male and female in his image. So this bill is pretty dangerous because it subjectifies science. It subjectifies the reality of human sexuality, and it declares books like the Bible a myth under the false premise that it's trying to protect people from coercive conversations or techniques that would force them to become heterosexual in their orientation or their practices.
And ultimately, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but ultimately, I think we could say this is a full on attack on Christianity.
Well, of course it is, because it's sort of like saying, hey, we need to get the army together, and we all need to scoot over to London, Ontario, because there's an alien invasion. When in reality, there's no alien invasion taking place, and so the army shows up, and instead of capturing or apprehending aliens, it starts to shoot the population or something like that. So it's a false premise. It's falsely proposing that there's an issue taking place, that homosexuals are somehow being abused or tortured. And under that false pretense, the government now shows up and it attacks and assaults anyone who might put up their hand and say, actually, I think we're made male or female, and I want to have a conversation with you about that. I want to actually counsel you. I want to instruct you to help you to understand that you're either a male or a female. Well, of course, in a country like Canada, we've seen increasing censorship, attacks on free speech. And this is nothing more, I'll just simplify it. It's nothing more than the federal government, Justin Trudeau in particular, and his handlers trying to appeal to the radical LGBTQ community, trying to protect them from anyone questioning their behavior, anyone even having a conversation with them, and making people like myself who want to have conversations with people about God's creational norms and ideals into criminals.
Right. Through a
And by the way,
nefarious law. Through a
it's blind.
nefarious law.
Exactly. And it flies in the face of virtually every human civilization from the beginning of time up till now. Because every
100%.
human civilization from the beginning of time up till now has understood this basic truth that people are created male or female. Now, in certain cultures, they then permit a person to act as a female if they're a male, or a male if they're a female, or they permit people to practice homosexual acts. Those acts are legal in Canada. They weren't in the 1960s, but they are now. But that's not what this bill's about. It wants to muzzle anyone who would want to have a conversation with a person about God's creational norms, about God's best for humanity, and about science, about the fact that people are created either male or female. And in that respect, you're right. It's a great word. It's nefarious. It's wicked. It's evil, and it's not helpful for either side of people that want to have these kind of conversations.
Yeah, and when I read this bill, it actually doesn't exclude even someone who says, for example, I mean, there's other faiths, by the way, that actually believe in the creational account in the sense of male and female. It's not just Christianity. So there might be some other people who belong to other faiths. They should be paying attention to this bill as well, because the way I read this bill, and I think you agree, there's only one way you can get in trouble. If I encourage you to participate in homosexuality, I can't get in trouble the way this bill is written. But if I encourage you to be heterosexual, now I can. And that's a huge conflict, because they're not saying in this bill that you can't encourage one way or the other. They're saying it's specific to heterosexuality. You cannot encourage that through conversation. So even if I came up to you and said, listen, I'm not really sure which one do you think I should do? Which way should I go, Aaron? I'm a little confused, but sometimes I'm thinking maybe I could go with heterosexuality. Sometimes I think I should go homosexuality. If you push me towards heterosexuality through conversation, right, through using, let's say, scriptures, that would be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, think of even a guidance counselor in a school who has a student that is struggling with gender identity, as we would call it, gender identity issues. So it would be legal for that teacher to say, hey, you should consider transgenderism. You should consider homosexuality. You should consider not identifying as a particular gender. But if they said, hey, you should consider heterosexuality, they'd be committing a criminal act. So one side now has all the marbles, the other side has nothing.
100%.
The other problem with this bill is it just broadly refers to sexual preferences and sexual orientations. So think about this. If this bill, which it does, validates all sexual orientations, and someone says, well, my sexual orientation is bent towards pedophilia or bestiality or something like that. By law, this bill validates those orientations as being okay. Now, it is true that there are other laws in place that would ban a person or punish a person if they committed the act of pedophilia or incest or bestiality. But what we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years as the LGBTQ community has grown and grown and grown, for example, is the way culture accepts behaviors and validates behaviors is by first validating preferences, by first validating orientations. So, when you and I were young, if you bumped into the average person on the Canadian on the street, even a non-Christian, they would have said, yeah, homosexuality or bestiality or whatever is wrong. And then we saw a shift in culture where people started talking about, well, you're born that way. It's okay to have those tendencies, have those urges. And then the next step is, okay, let's totally legalize it. So back in the 60s, Sodomy, for example, was still illegal in our country, which a lot of people don't know. Now it's fully legal. So one of the concerns I have about this bill is that proponents of pedophilia or incestuous relationships or bestiality now have at their disposal a law that validates their preference, So now all they have to do is just sort of push a little bit further to get the laws reduced or minimized so that they can then act on those preferences. So the bill is really, even if you are pro homosexual or pro transgender, this bill is very, very dangerous. It's a very sloppy bill. It's an ideological bill. It's a political bill, essentially. There was really no debate in the final hours. There was no dissenting voices. Check this out. Now, one single member of parliament in the entire Dominion of Canada objected to this bill in the House of Commons. Now, it wasn't voted on, and there was a few later on that said they felt they were kind of duped because there wasn't enough time to even raise their hands and ask questions. But the bottom line is it went through without debate. It became law really quick. The cons and the libs came into the middle of the floor, hugged each other, high-fived each other, congratulated. It's the entire thing is a political stunt, and even members of the LGBTQ community should frankly be embarrassed by it and should ask for it to be repealed, and something more meaningful and thoughtful, really intellectually based, should be put in place. So I would have no problem if Canada said, look, we're going to ban in our country the practice of electroshock therapy on homosexuals. I have no problem with that. Although it's not taking place in our country anyway, so it'd be a waste of time. But if you wanted something like that in the books, no problem. I wouldn't have a problem with that. But again, that's not what this bill is about. Canadians should read it, and they should seek to have it repealed.
And I think to just clarify your point, what you're saying is if you start by saying it's okay, for example, bestiality is okay to have the thought, it's only a matter of time before someone shows up and says, well, wait a minute, if it's okay for me to identify as that, why then could I not be in performance of the act? And I think that's what you're talking. In other words, that old adage, it's a slippery slope. Once you okay and validate that publicly, that the thinking and identifying that way is okay, then it's only a matter of time before you remove those laws that prevent them from doing it. And then, in fact, eventually goes to the point where you're actually encouraging it on many levels, right?
Yeah, and take the pedophilia issue, for example. So we have consensual sex laws in Canada that would forbid a 40-year-old man, for example, from having sex with a child. But there's the age of consent. And I think the age of consent is something like maybe the age of 16 in Canada. I mean, it's kind of shifted up and down a little bit. But if a person's 16, they're saying, okay, you're old enough to consent to it. Well, how hard would it be for the pro-pedophilia movement to reduce that down to 12? Not very hard at all. You can have an abortion at 12 without parental knowledge or consent. You can receive a vaccination at 12 in Canada without parental knowledge or consent. So we already have those things on the books. So it doesn't take much for the pro-pedophilia activists to say, look, Bill C-4 validates the orientation, because it says orientations, it's in the plural. So it validates my orientation if a person was, for example, inclined towards children. Well, let's get it dropped down to 12. Well, once it's dropped down to 12, well, then again, a generation or half a generation goes by and some new reason comes up to drop it down even further. So people should be horrified by this bill. It's a horribly worded bill. It's a sloppy bill. It's an ideological bill intended to do one thing: promote a particular ideology of human sexuality and ban creational norms.
And then on top of it, I have to add that I read somewhere one time that it says a country is the sum of its parts, and the parts are families. And when you start bringing in these destructive laws, it eventually starts destroying families. And when families are destroyed, the nation is weakened. And I don't mind saying it appears to me that in the last year to two, many people would say, wow, Canada is indeed appearing to be a very weak country. Might it be because of the loss of moral value, because of the um, descent, if you will, in moral high grounds that maybe at one time Canada used to have, and now as time has gone on, morality has been dropped and dropped and dropped. You see high divorce rates, high anxiety rates, lots of fear, lots of depression, none of which is of God, we would say, and certainly cannot be beneficial to a nation, even if you're an unbeliever. How can any of that sound beneficial? And so, furthering these nefarious laws and promoting them and propagating them, and then eventually, of course, if it ends up going to that place where people are allowed to act on those nefarious laws, what's going to happen to our nation? And that's why we're also kind of making this call to say, look, you may not be a Christian, you may not believe what we believe in the sense of the Holy Bible, but are you not noticing that even if you are of another faith, or even if you just have a basic old school traditional kind of vibe to you, I'm old school, I'm just an old school guy, right? Or an old school kind of woman. You should have a huge issue with this bill. This is not just an attack on the Christian faith, which of course hits us in the freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, but it's also for the average citizen in Canada to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's a good point. If a person was watching this and they weren't a Christian, I would just maybe want to have a little conversation to this effect. If you look at history, so first of all, I understand that all of us tend to be a little short-sighted. We tend to be a little narrow-minded, and we simplify things. So we might just say, oh, I don't care if someone wants to live this lifestyle or that lifestyle, whatever. It's no skin off my nose. That's generally how people approach these kinds of issues. Sort of everybody gets to choose, everybody sort of gets to do whatever they want. But there are a lot of problems with that kind of mindset. So if you're interested in cultural philosophy or cultural theology or sort of how nations rise and fall, you're going to want to sort of pay attention to some of the broader trends. And what's interesting, this is a fact, this is an indisputable fact, is that if you look at the whole globe, you count up all the countries of the world, the countries that we would call typically countries of the West, that's a language we often use, the West, that's the new word for what used to be called Christendom. So in other words, countries that sort of were Christianized, not to say that every citizen was a Christian, there's never been a country where every citizen's a Christian, but countries that were Christianized, countries that had laws that valued, for example, human liberty, that valued, for example, a moral code, that valued freedom of speech, that valued justice, that sought to abolish slavery. These kinds of countries that had a Christianized milieu to them are the countries that everybody wants to immigrate to. So people historically, there's no country, and no offense, it's just a fact, there's no country that is based upon Hindu laws or Buddhist laws or Islamic laws that people flock to for liberty and freedom.
That's just a fact.
There's no countries that are based on atheism, China or the old USSR. Nobody wanted to immigrate there, because if you don't have a country that's actually based on Christian values, then everybody suffers for that. But a country that's truly based on Christian values, we would call them creational norms or creational laws that are rooted in the Bible, are countries that actually provide greater freedom. This is interesting. provide greater freedom even for atheists.
And isn't that
And
interesting that you're bringing this up? And probably in the last year, I would suggest to you strongly, I've never met more people in Canada that want to leave Canada. Isn't that so? In other words, the less Christian we've become as
yes,
a nation, it just proves your point. The more and more and more people actually are. In fact, I know people who have left and
yes,
have
so
no
do I.
intention of coming back, and
Right.
lots of people that are in the works of it. Isn't that interesting? They were born here, they were raised here, and 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, now they want to leave. Why? Because we're becoming a nation that has lost sight of the absolute fact that we had things like the Lord's Day Act from 1906 to 1985. Or excuse me, yeah, 1985. And we had and still have engraved in the Peace Tower in Parliament Hill 25 Holy Writ scriptures. We are a nation that was built on Christian principles. And now, as we've departed from those principles as a nation, people want to leave.
Right. Well, people buy into what I would call the myth of spiritual neutrality. The
Mm,
myth of spiritual neutrality is this myth that secularism is spiritually neutral. So we would say Canada, yes, has a Christian basis to it, but we've evolved into a secular nation. And the thinking is that if you can create sort of a spiritually neutral state, then the church can flourish, the Muslims can flourish, the Hindus can flourish, people with different views on sexuality can flourish, etc. That's a myth because human culture and human society cannot function without a moral code. It's
100%.
impossible to function without a moral code. So when you dismiss the Christian worldview, when you relegate the Bible to a myth, you have to replace it with something. There has to be some legislation or some body that says this is right and this is wrong. And clearly, what the current government is guilty of is what we would call statism. Statism is where the state, the government in particular of a state, determine and decide what's right and wrong. So this is why you have the medical assistance and dying bill that came out last year, the conversion therapy bill. These are religious bills, and that they arbitrate on matters of human morality. They say it's right to kill a person here, it's not right to kill a person there. It's right to say this, it's not right to say that. So every nation that is a theocracy, meaning a nation that is run by some god, historically it was the benevolent God of the Bible that was acknowledged in nations like Canada. Now it's the God of the state. And if people think that the God of the Bible is incompetent in running a nation and determining the laws of a nation, look around you and see how well people like Justin Trudeau are going to do replacing him. Because literally, Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, and his cabinet, and many in government today, function now not as politicians, but as high priests and clergy over the nation. They're always wagging a finger. That's right. Do the right thing. Don't do that. This is what you can do. This is what you can't do. This is what you can say. This is what you can't say. So there's no, we have not progressed. We have not evolved to a state of sort of a higher consciousness of spirituality. We've simply swapped out the Christian God for the God of the state.
And
And the God of the
interestingly enough,
state,
yeah, and interestingly enough, I think that if you were to ask anyone, because if these processes have been good, then is there a particular reason why I could go up to anybody on the street and say, would you think that the last 2 years, give or take, have been the worst years of your life? And they would, I could guarantee it, and I'm sure you would too, Aaron, they would say, absolutely. So the proof, as they say, is in the pudding. It is absolutely clear that the more we let these nefarious leaders inject their nefarious ideas, ideologies, they are indeed religious, but it is not a lovely religion. It's not Christianity. It's the opposite of Christianity. And now the results are in, and they've come in quite quickly, actually, that the more they speak these things into existence, the worse this country has become.
Right. Because what the Christian God does is the Christian God, out of his own moral holiness, legislates what's right and wrong because he's the creator, he's the engineer. And even if we don't necessarily understand the reason for it, when we choose to obey what he says is right or wrong, we actually benefit from it because God's laws are meant to protect and bless us. Even if at first blush they may offend our desire to be hedonistic or selfish. When you actually follow God's creational laws, God's norms, you benefit from it. So if God says, hey, I know it might not always be fun, but tell the truth. I know you might think at first blush, I'm trying to like constrain you, but be faithful to your wife. I know that you may have other things to do. You may feel busy at times, but be a conscientious citizen, be a good Samaritan. These things may offend our selfishness. We're all innately selfish and a little hedonistic, pleasure seeking. But when we follow our Creator's laws, we're blessed. But what statist governments do is they're selfish, and we've seen this. It's laws for me, laws for thee, but not for me. So it's you'll stay home in order to stay safe. And by the way, we're going to the cottage in the Muskokas, or we're
Yeah.
going to jet set to the Caribbean, or we're going to show up at the illegal rally during lockdowns. Even though you got to stay home and close your church, we're going to show up because we know we're going to score political brownie points. Or you're too stupid. We're not going to give you the information you've asked for about ICU rates in hospitals or vaccine efficacy. Just trust us. So this is where when God rules a nation, there's benevolence and grace. There are laws, there are rights and wrongs, but they're for our good, our own good. But when the state dons the mantle of high priest and king, there's tyranny and totalitarianism and abuse, and liberty goes away pretty quick.
And it happens repeatedly. The pattern happens repeatedly. You can read the Bible for sure and see that exact pattern. But for those that might be out there that say, well, I don't know too much about the Bible, or I feel that that's a religious book, well, then just look at your own history. Go ahead and study it. Study the last 100 to 150 years, and you will see that exactly what my good brother Aaron Rock just said is 100% factual and is true. So now, and of course, when you see the hypocrisy, I'm always led to remind everyone that scripture where the leaven of the Pharisees, beware of it. And what was it? Indeed, it was hypocrisy. So it's another obvious sign to our nation that we need to really repent and get back to Christ Jesus and the biblical principles. And for those that might be out there and say, well, I'm not a religious person. Okay, that's your point of view, but ultimately you can see the results of us walking away from Christian principles. You can see it, and you see it real fast. So, at least, if nothing else, why don't we turn around and get back to those biblical principles and speak against these laws and do everything and anything we can to get rid of them? So, of course, in order for that to happen, we need spiritual leaders like yourself, Brother Aaron. I don't mind saying, as a Canadian citizen, by the way, as well as a Christian. But I'll tell you straight, even if I was simply a Canadian citizen that liked to sip margaritas by my saltwater pool on a daily basis, I would be behind you 100% because the results are in. I can see that what you're saying is actually manifesting itself in reality. So this is just the way it is. So how would you approach someone, because you're a spiritual leader and I appreciate you, but there have been some whom I love and admire as well, but have been, for lack of better words, taking the positioning of things like, well, we're just supposed to tell everyone about Jesus, and we don't really get involved in that political stuff. It's really not our thing. We're not really going to participate in that. And yet they're considering themselves spiritual leaders. What would you say to them, firmly, but of course with love, but truthfully though, because you can't have grace without truth. When you have
Right.
just grace, I call that brown nosing and pandering. We need grace and truth. So what would you say to them, bro?
Yeah, well, one of our responsibilities as Christians is to speak out against injustice. So the prophets called the nation of Israel many, many times to speak out against some common injustices they were experiencing at the time. Orphans were being left to die, widows were being overlooked in a culture that was very patriarchal. And God called the prophets to come to the nation and say, smarten up. You can't just be, quote unquote, going to church, going to the temple to worship while people around you are suffering. So part of the Christian calling is to speak out against injustice as we see it in culture. So it's not our job to run the country. There's a ontological separation between the state and the church. We're not interested in the state running the church. We're not interested in the church running the state. We're not interested in the state running the family or the family running the church. Like, these are different spheres, and God has given a measure of authority to these different spheres and the leaders within them. But the church is called, the people of God are called to be a moral conscience when a nation goes adrift. Jesus confronted power. He confronted the Pharisees, not just because they had their doctrine wrong, but they were complicit in societal injustice. Jesus called out the average Jew. Should they overlook, a person that was beaten at the side of the road? And he highlights the Samaritan, this unlikely figure who exercises more justice towards this man that was beaten at the side of the road than the people of God should have. So when you look around you and you see people losing their jobs because their consciences are being violated, they refuse to take an experimental vaccine. And by the way, if a person chooses to do that and they've done their research, that's on them. But we live in a country where people have historically acknowledged bodily autonomy and bodily freedom. That's wrong. It's wrong for it's necessary for us to speak out against that sort of thing. When we see a state deciding new categories of human sexuality, redefining marriage, we're supposed to put up our hand and say, actually, you don't have the authority to do that.
In other words, when they're boldly speaking lies, when they're boldly putting in nefarious laws, when they're boldly professing their ideologies, the response from any of us, anyone who's claiming certainly to be led by the Holy Spirit, that has strong faith in God, should have all the more reason to be even more bold, speaking against those lies with truth and speaking against those nefarious laws. And if you're not, then quite frankly, your stewardship is clearly in a down spiral, and you need to correct that. Would that be a fair assessment?
I think so. One of the things I've said to people, just to kind of help them to remember this in a very simple way, is what is politics today? If people say, well, Christians shouldn't be political, okay, I understand that if politicians are staying within their boundaries. So I'm not going to clutter up my preaching time criticizing the state if they decide to pave the road outside of my house with concrete versus asphalt. I'm not going to criticize them if they decide to change stop signs to orange and white instead of red and white, or if they choose to hire more soldiers or buy tanks from whatever company. These are political decisions that make sense, purest political decisions that make sense for a state to be entrusted to make on our behalf. But when politicians become religious, become theological, when politicians interfere with the ministry and worship life of the church, or begin to destroy the lives of the people they've been entrusted to oversee, that's when we have a moral responsibility to push back and to speak out.
Wonderful, because it is indeed. I had someone who came up to me and said, well, Shade, I still, fully believe in separation of church and state. And I said, well, that's great. So could you tell the state to get out of our church? See, it's not the church that went to City Hall and said, hey, what are you guys doing over here? Hey, you guys, you stop getting together so often and, stay 6 feet apart. We're not the ones who went over there and told them to do that. They are the ones who came into our establishments, if you will, to our praise and worship centers, to our assembly locations, and they started sticking their nose in our business. And then on top of it now, they're actually boldly creating laws that make it criminal for us to actually practice and or speak what our faith says. So we would love it if the state would actually separate from the church, because it's been looking like they've been trying to put their paws all over and into the church, and all the while trying to create their own religion. And you can name it whatever you want, but it is clear to me that it is the state that's telling me I can't cross the border. It's the state that is telling me that I have to cover my breathing apparatus in order to buy sour cream. It's not the church that's telling me that. It's not the preachers that are telling me that. It's the state. It's the state telling me that I need to stay 6 feet apart, or whatever it is that they've been announcing in the last almost 2 years. It's all been them interfering with our lives, and quite frankly, best as I could tell, walking over every single solitary civil liberty that we have been enjoying in this country, and all under the guides of love your neighbor.
Yeah.
I mean, the hypocrisy.
Which is a moral statement.
Right. Which is a moral statement.
So Christians also need to understand, whether you like this or not, okay, whether you like this, what I'm about to say or not, the Bible never assigns to the state authority over my health. It just doesn't.
Period.
The state has not assigned authority over my health. So even if people are being stacked up in the street like cordwood, corpses, people dying left, right, and center, by God's law, the state is never assigned authority over my health. Now, the Bible does speak of the responsibility that community has to one another when there's a contagious disease, found in the Levitical law. And God's very simple plan is you quarantine the sick until they're better, period. That's what you do.
Period.
But what the state has done, the biggest error the state has made, in my view, in all of this, and it's because of a Darwinian worldview, actually, that reduces human existence down to our biotic health, our biology. And many Christians have bought into this as well. They've closed their churches down time and time again because they're so terrified of killing people. They're so terrified of this biological threat, this virus, this disease. But in trying to rescue people, and let's just say for a moment that you could prove that we'd rescued 5,000 people in Windsor by slamming our churches shut and closing down businesses and on and on and on. Let's say we could prove that we saved 5,000 people from physical death by all these lockdowns. The problem with that is that human beings are not just biological beings. We're also social, we're spiritual, we have a psychology about us, we're emotional, we're mental beings. And the destruction, which isn't counted on a day-by-day basis, like the case counts of viral spread. The destruction that has been brought upon people spiritually. Literally, I've seen people walk away from the Christian faith, apostatize, literally abandon Christ in all of this. It's happening.
Yep.
Marriages that have literally fallen apart.
Literally.
People that have lost generations of wealth. People that have fallen back into pornographic addictions, drug addictions. Okay, no, there's no case numbers for that on the WECHU website every day. We're not even counting that.
That's
and
right.
it reveals something about a culture. When a culture looks at humans and says, we're just biotic beings. We just sort of got here biologically. That's the basis of Darwinian theory. We're not spiritual beings. We don't need to care for a person's spiritual health. Well, what we've been pleading with the government to consider from the beginning is balance. Balance. If there's a contagion sweeping through a community, you don't think church leaders are smart enough and loving enough to make adjustments to protect their congregants? We have physicians and nurse practitioners and nurses in our church that we would readily consult. But the states, the only weapon in the state's arsenal is lock them down, close their businesses. And then we have all of the politics behind that, because we know that's not what it's about. When you close down hundreds of thousands of small businesses and tell everybody they have to go to Costco or Walmart, the big box stores, you're clearly pandering to a part of the economy and not the other part of the economy. So there's even some injustice in here. But the main point I want people thinking about is, you have to think beyond the biological threat. And fortunately, now that we've had 2 years to observe this, even the biological threat is way overblown. It's way overblown.
Absolutely. 100%.
99.99999% of people are fine.
Yep.
They're fine. Many, many people, like probably yourself and myself included, have natural immunity. And there's hundreds of thousands of other people that have natural immunity as well. So this is a good thing. And yes, people will die in this pandemic. That's life. But people have also left the faith. People have also died from suicides, drug overdoses, marriages have fallen apart. And the longer you continue to run these totalitarian plays, the more destruction you're going to see on culture.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And I couldn't help but notice that while this is going on, and of course, we believe, and I think the evidence is in, that they've completely overblown everything. Interestingly enough, I think their actions prove that. And what action am I speaking of? That while we're in this horrifying pandemic that they're claiming, they still managed to find a solid faction of people to put together Bill C-4. I mean, does that not kind of speak to the idea that they're kind of maybe distracting us, right? And putting fear continuously in the media and then pointing fingers at certain people who have decided, hey, you know what? I think we kind of see that the evidence you're providing has been weak, and sometimes it's just plain out not there. Like, for example, the efficacy of the muzzles, that's still a ghost. No one has provided us with that. And yet, in the midst of all this, you've found time and people and resources to put together a bill that just so happens, what a coincidence, to make it illegal to freely speak, I don't know, for example, Romans 1, a Bible book that has been preached on, depending where you're at, for at least, give or take, 1900 to 2000 years. And suddenly, while this huge thing is going on over here, you managed to find a little group of people to put together and push through a bill that makes it illegal for my brother Aaron, or quite frankly, even myself, to preach Romans 1 out there potentially and make it criminal to do so. Does that seem a little, I don't know, strange?
Well, I'm just laughing because I'm thinking about all of the different societal issues, the quote unquote social justice issues that our elected officials seem to be really concerned about. And all of these things they have a concern about are things that, from a different angle, the church has a concern about. So we would have a concern about torturing people in order to get them to conform to a particular view of sexuality. We have a problem with the state forcibly educating Indigenous children. We have a problem with racism. We have a problem with people looking down on others of a different skin tone or cultural background. These are our specialties as Christians, to remind people that every person is made in the image and likeness of God, that they are of infinite value and worth, right? So this is our job. But what the state has done is they take these issues and they always wreck them. So, for example, during these lockdowns, when people like myself were being fined hundreds of thousands of dollars and threatened with jail time just for calling my people to worship Jesus and find hope and healing in Christ, we have our prime minister in the same province that I reside breaking the law in order to attend a Black Lives Matter rally. And if you actually look, if you actually take time to read, which I do, the statements on the Black Lives Matter website, or to observe their behavior, you quickly conclude, aha, this actually isn't about Black lives mattering. I mean, what conscientious Christian on planet Earth would disagree with the statement Black Lives Matter? We all agree with that.
Of course.
We all agree that people should not be treated poorly because of their skin tone.
How many times does it say God is no respecter of persons in our Bible? Is it at least 4, maybe more times than that?
This is why Christians like William Wilberforce in England spent so much of his political career fighting against the slave trade.
Absolutely.
So we fight against these things, but people need to understand this. The Black Lives Matter movement is not about Black lives mattering. It's a social Marxist, a cultural Marxist organization that's trying to bring to an end biblical values in culture. The indigenous issues out in the mass graves, which are now all being questioned out in British Columbia, of course we would say that forcibly educating some other group's children is wrong. But what's fascinating in all of that is instead of burning the Capitol buildings or the state buildings in Canada, they burnt the churches.
Right.
Because unfortunately, the foolish Christians back then decided to be agents of the state to put their plan into practice. But the reason why we had residential schools in the first place was because of stateism, where the state took your children and said, we can do a better job educating your children. But instead of attacking the state, they deflect to their agents, the church. And the church needed to repent of that behavior. But this is why it's all smoke and mirrors. And when you have guys like Justin Trudeau or Doug Ford or whoever it might be standing up and saying, Black lives matter, but not if you're a Black trucker and you're out of work, and not if you're a Black nurse or a Black physician, or don't agree with our agenda, we're going to toss you to the curb. Or when they're saying we disagree with the residential school system, the church should pay for it, but they're the ones that came up with the idea. Or when they try to force, they have this conversion therapy bill, which is our primary subject today, which isn't about conversion therapy. It's all smoke and mirrors. It's all designed to promote a cultural Marxist, godless society, an absolute free-for-all, governed by the state, where the state becomes your high priest, ruler, and king. And this is where free people are often very forgetful of history.
Mm-hmm.
So what a joke. Last November the 11th, what an absolute farce for people to be wearing poppies and saying, we remember the sacrifices that our forebears made to secure our freedom, and then calling for the punishment and penalization of fellow citizens who wouldn't get a shot. Absolutely. Or who wanted to gather for worship, or who had a few extra people over for a barbecue. It's a complete farce.
Yep. That
our country doesn't value the liberties and freedoms that have been bestowed on us from our forebears. Free people, once they get used to their freedom, you know what they always do? They always return to slavery.
Yeah.
They get lazy. They don't want to fight for it any longer. And they want the all-powerful, supposedly benevolent state to manage every area of their lives. And the state is more than happy to do so.
Yeah, when I kind of look at the cycles, both in history and even when I study scripture, if I recall correctly, it seems to go, okay, so people are in bondage, they finally come to a spiritual faith, then spiritual faith leads them to courage, and that courage brings them liberty because they're finally courageous and they get that liberty. And then that liberty, of course, always brings you abundance because let's face it, a free market, a free society with a good, solid constitution and moral code always brings out great abundance, and that's why people will want to come to the country, and then they add their flair. And then from at that point of abundance, though, oftentimes then you enter into, and this is where that forgetfulness comes into, complacency. And then from complacency, it seems to go to the apathy, a lack of concern. And then apathy ends up quickly becoming dependency, and then dependency right back into bondage, right
Yes.
there. That seems to be the cycle that I'm seeing in the scriptures. That's the cycle that I see in history. And we're going back, and you can see it happening as we speak, that the nation is going under bondage, hence why so many people want to leave. And you can clearly see that it's directly connected to a departure from true biblical Christianity. And not only, as you mentioned, not everybody in Canada was a Christian, but they subscribed to those principles. So, for example, the Lord's Day Act, everybody liked Sunday off. Even the person who didn't necessarily go to Harvest Bible, right? That person was still enjoying their Sunday, maybe with their family. And then because, as the scriptures say, that Sabbath was made for man,
Mhm.
right? It doesn't say for
A
a
blessing.
Christian man. It's for all, right? And then in that, it's a blessing. And we've talked about that before. And isn't it interesting that the further away we get from those principles, the more and more you can see the results. And yet, with the results being in, so many still want to comply rather than speak out and becoming bold. And I hope that this video is going to help them to realize that sitting on your hands and keeping your mouth shut would be exactly what the bad people would want you to do. They would
Yes.
love it. That's maybe part of the reason why they're trying to make laws that I think even Mr. Jordan Peterson has talked about this compelling speech. When you compel someone to either say this or compel people to not be able to say that, is another huge marker of a country gone in the wrong direction. And I really appreciate you coming on to help everyone understand that we need to steer away from that. Is there any other things that we can say in this video to encourage people to really get, because you and I both know there are plenty of people that agree with, if not all of what you've said, a lot of what you've said. It's not whatever numbers you're seeing. I think the truckers, for example, right now might be making a bit of a stir, right? It's not like we went around saying, "Oh, are you a Christian trucker? Are you do you
Oh,
read the Bible?" No, we didn't do that, and yet here they are, a group that maybe most of us wouldn't assume would be making such a display, and yet here they are. Could you comment on some of that for us?
yeah, just a couple final thoughts would be number one, a lot of people are very resistant and they get offended if someone compares what's going on in Canada today to communism or Stalinism or Marxism or what took place in Nazi Germany. And we fully understand the circumstances are very different. But fundamentally, the reason why Hitler did what he did is because he actually believed it. The reason why Stalin did what he did is because he actually believed in that philosophy. The reason why the commies in China do what they do is because they actually believe in it. And the people that are currently governing our country right now actually believe in statism. They actually believe they have the power and authority to define marriage, to define human sexuality, to muzzle free speech, to control your property, to educate your children, to control whether you can work or not, open your business, close your business. And the more you give them, the more they're going to take. So you may think, well, they seem to be well motivated. It doesn't matter what a person's motive is. It doesn't matter whether a person really believes in it or doesn't believe in it. The state doesn't have authority, and we cannot give them authority over every sphere of life. What we would be happy to give them authority to do is what God gives them authority to do, which is to oversee public justice, to make sure that evildoers are punished and good people are rewarded. That's it. Then let the church do its job. Let moms and dads do their job. The other comment I wanted to make is it's really important that we start to share this kind of information with our children, because we're not going to fix this in the next 4 to 5 years. This is a multi-generational fight. We got here by lies, we get out by truth. So we have to speak the truth, repeatedly speak the truth, never back down, and slowly but surely we incrementally move the needle forward. You know, our forebears, many of them came to North America for freedom. I know there's a lot of desire for people to move away, but moving away just to flee what's happening in our country might not be the most strategic move, for the simple reason that this is a problem that's sweeping across the Western world. And the US might be 5, 10, 15 years behind us, but everything that's going on here is there already and will eventually take hold to the same degree that it's taken place here. We really need to recreate culture. This is why the Puritans came to North America. They just didn't come to run, they came to recreate, to rebuild. They built nations on God's laws, on creational norms. And that's what we need to do as a nation. It's a long-term, ominous fight, but we need new institutions, new medical institutions, legal institutions. We need strong churches to stand up against tyranny. And one lobby, one convoy, one letter, one petition isn't going to fix this. This is a long-term fight. But it's something that God, I think, has called our generation to participate in. And we're going to do it even if we suffer, so that future generations can be blessed by our efforts.
I love it, man. What a great way to end this video and encourage those who know, they can see it. They know that what you just said is 100% bang on. And I don't need really big fancy words to say, hey, man, that was fantastic. That was great. And I really do hope this encourages others to really tune into what you just said and maybe take it to their meditation closet and really think about what they can do to speak out, to make it be known, and to act against this, so that, much like you said, one step at a time, it's going to take some time to undo what has been done. However, it's so important and so necessary that it's just great to hear the way you presented that. And that's why I appreciate you coming on with me. And I really
appreciate it, bro.
Hey, man. And again, I'm going to tell everybody, if you do want to hear some good sound biblical teachings, I'm going to put a link in the description, and get over there and check out Aaron's teachings. And thank you, Aaron. Thank you for fighting the fight. Thank you for fighting that fight for even those who would oppose you. And that's loving your enemies, my good brother.
Yeah.
That is indeed loving your enemies. You're actually fighting for rights and freedoms for individuals who would use those freedoms to oppose you.
Right. At the end of the day, they will be blessed by our efforts as well. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
I love it. Amen. Man, thanks, brother. Thanks for coming on with me. And we'll definitely see you real soon. And again, God bless you, and greatly appreciate your presence here.
Thanks. Have a good rest of your day, bro.
Thanks, man.